Before there was Maryland, before there were boundaries, colonies, or even the word America as we know it, there was land, ancient, quiet, and wild. The Chesapeake Bay shimmered under the sun, surrounded by dense forests, wetlands, and winding rivers, long before European ships ever touched its shores. This region was alive with people, stories, and traditions that had stretched for thousands of years. They were the indigenous peoples of the Chesapeake, the Piscataway, the Nanticoke, the Powhatan, and many others whose names have faded from most maps but remain written in the soil, the rivers, and the language of the land itself. They lived in organized societies, guided by careful balance with nature, with one another, and with the spirits that shaped their world. Villages dotted the waterways, built from bark and woven reed, their fires glowing in the mist of early morning. Hunting, fishing, and farming blended into one rhythm: corn, beans, and squash. The three sisters grew together, feeding families and binding communities. Trade networks stretched for miles, reaching deep into the interior. Shell beads, copper, and animal pelts passed hand to hand. A quiet economy rooted not in greed, but in respect. The Chesapeake was not wilderness waiting to be tamed. It was a world already complete. Then, in the early 1600s, the balance began to tremble. Across the Atlantic, in Europe, ambition, faith, and commerce were colliding. Empires were expanding, driven by hunger for land, resources, and power. The English had already carved out a fragile foothold in Virginia at Jamestown, just south of what would one day be Maryland. But north of there, along the wide rivers and shimmering estuaries, the land was still considered open, unexplored, unclaimed. In 1632, an English nobleman named Cecil Calvert, known as the Second Lord Baltimore, received a charter from King Charles I. The charter granted him a vast stretch of territory north of the Potomac River, to be named after the king's wife, Queen Henrietta Maria. That name, Maryland, would soon appear on maps, though the people already living there had never called it that. The Calverts had a vision: to build a colony that could be both profitable and peaceful, a sanctuary for English Catholics who were persecuted back home under Protestant rule. It was an experiment, part religious refuge, part business venture. In 1634, two ships, the Ark and the Dove, crossed the Atlantic, carrying around 140 settlers, gentlemen, craftsmen, laborers, and a handful of Catholic priests. They landed on St. Clement's Island, near the mouth of the Potomac, and soon established St. Mary's City, the first settlement of Maryland. It was a hopeful beginning, but also a fragile one. The settlers faced an untamed landscape, harsh winters, and the constant need for food and cooperation. At first, they relied heavily on the Piscataway people, who offered trade and tentative friendship. The two sides shared food, guidance, and uneasy trust. But as more ships arrived, bringing more settlers and more ambition, that fragile peace would soon strain. For a time, though, Maryland was different. Lord Baltimore's dream of religious tolerance set it apart from other colonies. In a century when people were killed for their faith in Europe, Maryland's early laws promised something extraordinary: freedom of worship, at least for Christians. It was imperfect, limited, and sometimes ignored, but it planted an idea that would grow far beyond the colony's borders, that conscience should be free. Still, survival came first. The settlers cleared land, built houses, and began growing crops, mostly tobacco, the plant that would soon define their fortunes and their fate. The tobacco engine. If religion gave Maryland its soul, tobacco gave it its heartbeat. By the 1640s, the sweet, pungent smell of drying tobacco hung over the colony. It was the perfect export, easy to grow, easy to sell, and endlessly demanded in Europe. Fields spread across the tidewater plains, and fortunes grew as green leaves turned into gold. But tobacco was labor hungry. It required endless hours of planting, tending, and drying. At first, colonists relied on indentured servants, mostly poor Europeans, who agreed to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World. Some servants survived their contracts and earned freedom, becoming small farmers or tradesmen. Others died under the brutal weight of overwork and disease. For a time, Maryland was a colony of hope and hardship mixed together, a place where opportunity and suffering walked side by side. Over the decades, however, the balance shifted. The supply of indentured servants fell, and planters turned increasingly to a new, darker source of labor, enslaved Africans. Ships began to arrive carrying men, women, and children who had been captured, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic against their will. The first enslaved Africans in Maryland arrived in the mid 1600s, and by the early 1700s, slavery had become the backbone of its economy. A brutal system of laws grew around it, laws that defined people not as human beings, but as property. Families were torn apart, lives stolen, and generations trapped in bondage to feed the wealth of a few. The fields of Maryland thrived, but they thrived on stolen labor. Even in those early years, Maryland was a place of contradictions, founded for freedom, but built on servitude, a refuge for faith, but a land of deep injustice. It was a tension that would never truly go away. By the mid 1600s, Maryland was no longer the fragile experiment it had once been. The colony had grown, plantations stretching along the rivers, tobacco barrels stacked high on docks, ships coming and going across the Atlantic. But beneath the surface, Maryland was cracking. The dream of harmony that had brought Lord Baltimore's settlers across the ocean was fading fast. Catholics, who had once found refuge here, were now a small and increasingly embattled minority. Protestants, outnumbering them and emboldened by events back in England, began to push back hard. Across the ocean, England was tearing itself apart in civil war. Puritans versus Royalists, Parliament versus the King. And when England fought, its colonies fought in echo. In Maryland, power shifted like sand in a storm. The Calvert family, who had built the colony as a place of religious tolerance, suddenly found themselves facing rebellion. Protestant settlers rose up, claiming the Calverts were using their power unfairly. The conflict came to a head in 1655 at the Battle of the Severn, near what is now Annapolis. It wasn't a grand clash between armies, just a few hundred men on each side. But for Maryland, it was a civil war of its own. Blood was spilled, and the Calverts temporarily lost control of their colony. Even after they regained power, the old trust was gone. Laws changed. Catholics were barred from holding office. The very people who had crossed an ocean seeking freedom of worship were now persecuted in the land they'd built. Maryland's experiment in tolerance had failed, but its memory would linger, an idea waiting for a second chance. Building a colony. In the early 1700s, the colony began to rebuild and redefine itself. Annapolis grew into a graceful capital, its streets winding like spokes toward the domed State House that still stands today. To the north, another town began to rise, grittier, busier, fueled by trade and ambition. Baltimore. The two cities would come to represent very different faces of Maryland. Annapolis, the elegant seat of government and tradition. Baltimore, the restless heart of labor and growth. Maryland's boundaries also took shape. Surveyors Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon walked the forests and farmlands, marking the line that would become one of America's most famous borders, the Mason-Dixon line. At the time, it simply settled a dispute with Pennsylvania. Later, it would stand as the symbolic divide between North and South, freedom and slavery. Maryland was settling into its identity, part Southern, part Northern, but not entirely either. It was a place in between, both geographically and morally, and that in-between character would define its destiny. A road to revolution. By the 17th, the colonies were restless. Taxes, trade restrictions, and the arrogance of distant rulers began to wear thin. The old loyalty to Britain, once taken for granted, now felt like a chain. In taverns and meeting halls, from Boston to Baltimore, people began to ask the same question. Why should men an ocean away decide our fate? Maryland's merchants bristled at the Stamp Act, which taxed printed materials, and the Townshend Acts, which taxed imports. Protests spread. British goods were boycotted. Pamphlets circulated, calling for liberty and representation. In Annapolis, a crowd of angry patriots boarded a ship called the Peggy Stewart, loaded with British tea, and burned it to the waterline. It was Maryland's own Tea Party, a bold declaration that the colony was done being pushed around. When the call for independence came, Maryland hesitated at first. Its leaders wanted unity but feared the chaos of rebellion. Still, as events spiraled, the tide became irresistible. By 1770, Maryland's delegates joined the Continental Congress and signed the Declaration of Independence. In the fields of battle that followed, Maryland's soldiers earned a fierce reputation. At Long Island, they stood their ground against overwhelming British forces, covering the retreat of George Washington's army. Their courage that day was so extraordinary that Washington himself called them the Old Line, a name that still echoes in Maryland's nickname, the Old Line State. As war raged, Maryland also built a new government at home. The Maryland Constitution of 1770 replaced royal authority with a system of elected representatives. The capital moved fully to Annapolis, where ideas of self-rule became reality. But independence was only the beginning of a deeper struggle. What kind of nation and what kind of state Maryland would become? The war's end and a new beginning. When the revolution ended in Saint-Dié, the young United States faced a fragile peace. The war had been won, but the future was uncertain. In Annapolis, something remarkable happened. George Washington came to resign his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. In the quiet of the State House before the assembled Congress, he handed back his military power. No speeches of conquest, no crown, no demands, just a simple act of humility that stunned the world. It was a moment that defined both a man and a nation, and it happened on Maryland soil. Later that same year, the Treaty of Paris was ratified in Annapolis, officially ending the Revolutionary War. For a brief time, the city served as the national capital. Here, Congress met, argued, and began the long process of turning rebellion into government. Maryland's central position, both geographically and politically, made it an ideal bridge between North and South. Its ports fed commerce, its people fed armies and ideas, but its old contradictions remained. Slavery still lingered in the fields and households, even as the language of freedom filled its halls of power. In the late 18th century, Maryland's destiny began to shift from soil to steel, from plantation to port. Baltimore's harbor grew busier every year, crowded with ships carrying grain, tobacco, iron, and rum. Immigrants arrived by the thousands, Irish, German, Polish, bringing new skills, new faiths, and new dreams. The state that had begun as a narrow refuge for Catholics was becoming something larger, a crossroads of nations and ideas. By the early 1800s, Maryland was on the move, its fields rich, its towns thriving, its cities alive with trade and ambition. But prosperity would not come without cost. Another war loomed, and the bay's calm waters would soon echo again with the thunder of guns. Barely 30 years after the American Revolution ended, Maryland found itself again, staring down the same enemy. Britain and the United States were back at odds, this time over trade restrictions, British naval blockades, and the impressment of American sailors. In taverns from Annapolis to Baltimore, people muttered that independence had been won, but respect had not. By 1812, Congress declared war. For most Americans, it was distant news. For Maryland, it was personal. The Chesapeake Bay, its heart, its highway, was now an open door for invasion. The British returned. British warships prowled the bay, raiding small towns, burning warehouses, and seizing supplies. Farmers along the shoreline woke to the sight of red uniforms marching through their fields. In 1814, the threat came closer still. The British landed near Washington, D.C., Maryland's own doorstep. They swept through Bladensburg, defeating hastily gathered American troops, and marched straight into the capital. Flames lit the night sky as they burned the Capitol and the President's house, the same walls that would later be rebuilt into the White House. If the fall of Washington was a humiliation, what happened next in Maryland would become a turning point in America's story. The Battle for Baltimore. After burning Washington, British forces sailed north toward Baltimore, determined to crush the city that had produced so many privateer ships, the nimble American vessels that had harassed British trade for years. To reach Baltimore's harbor, they had to pass a fort that stood at the entrance like a sentinel, Fort McHenry. Inside were fewer than 1,000 defenders, commanded by Major George Armistead. They knew the city's fate rested on them. On the night of September 13th, 1814, British ships opened fire, bombs, rockets, and mortars arcing through the sky in a storm of light and thunder. The bombardment lasted 25 relentless hours. From the deck of a British ship in the harbor, a captured American lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched helplessly. As long as he could still see the huge American flag flying above the fort through the flashes of bombardment, he knew Baltimore still stood. When the guns finally fell silent and dawn broke, the smoke lifted, and the flag was still there. The British withdrew. Baltimore was safe. Key scribbled a poem that night, words that captured the awe and relief of a nation still struggling to believe it could survive. It began, "Oh, say, can you see?" Those words would become the Star-Spangled Banner, America's national anthem. The victory at Baltimore turned the War of 1812 from humiliation to hope. For Maryland, it was a moment of pride, a declaration that its people, shipbuilders, merchants, soldiers, and citizens, had stood firm when the nation's capital had fallen. A city on the rise in the decades that followed, Baltimore exploded with energy. The harbor that had once echoed with cannon fire now rang with hammers, saws, and the whistles of steamboats. Trade poured in from every direction: tobacco, grain, lumber, coal, and later iron and steel. By mid-century, Baltimore was one of America's largest cities, a magnet for immigrants and a model of industry. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, launched in 1827, became the first major rail line in the United States. Its iron tracks cut west through Maryland's hills, carrying goods and people faster than anyone had imagined possible. The BO didn't just connect Baltimore to the interior, it symbolized a new era. Maryland was no longer a quiet colonial outpost. It was part of a nation, hurtling toward modernity. Factories lined the rivers, and shipyards along the harbor built clipper ships that were the envy of the world. The air smelled of iron, salt, and progress. With work came opportunity and tension. As the city grew, so did its divides between rich and poor, free and enslaved, black and white, native-born and immigrant. The shadow of slavery. Even as Baltimore thrived, slavery still cast its long shadow over Maryland. The state's position, literally and morally, was in between, north of the Deep South, south of Pennsylvania's freedom. Plantations still dotted the southern counties, while in the cities, a large community of free African Americans lived and worked beside the enslaved. Baltimore, by the 1840s, had more free black residents than any city in the nation. They built churches, schools, and businesses, forming a vibrant culture that would lay the groundwork for future movements. But freedom in Maryland was always precarious. Laws restricted where free blacks could live, how they could travel, and what they could own. The danger of being kidnapped and sold back into slavery was constant. Out of this world came some of the state's most courageous figures. Frederick Douglass, born enslaved on the Eastern Shore, escaped to freedom and became one of America's greatest voices for abolition and equality. Harriet Tubman, also born on the Eastern Shore, risked her life again and again, leading others to freedom along the Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses and secret routes that ran through Maryland's backwoods and byways. Their stories turned Maryland from a borderland into a battleground of conscience. Tension builds. By the 1850s, the United States was splitting apart over slavery. Every new law, every new compromise, seemed only to deepen the divide. In Maryland, neighbors could disagree not just on politics, but on morality itself. In the same household, one brother might sympathize with the South, another with the North. In towns like Frederick and Hagerstown, newspapers debated the fate of the Union. In Baltimore's docks, workers argued about abolition. The Mason-Dixon line, once a quiet border survey, had become a line between two incompatible worlds. The storm that had been building for decades was about to break. The history of Maryland, a house divided. This chapter carries Maryland through the Civil War, emancipation, and the decades that followed. A story of loss, freedom, and reinvention. By 1861, Maryland was once again at the center of the nation's greatest conflict, this time not against a foreign power, but against itself. The Civil War had arrived, and the state that had always lived in between would now feel the cost of that position like no other. Torn in two. When Southern states seceded from the Union, Maryland stood at a crossroads. Its economy was tied to the South, its geography to the North. Its people were split by loyalty, faith, and fear. One thing was certain: if Maryland joined the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. would be completely surrounded by enemy territory. President Lincoln could not let that happen. In April 1860, Union troops passing through Baltimore were attacked by angry crowds. Stones and gunfire erupted on Pratt Street. The first blood of the Civil War spilled in Maryland. Lincoln responded decisively. Federal soldiers occupied the city, bridges were guarded, and suspected Confederate sympathizers, including state legislators, were arrested without trial. It was a harsh measure, but it worked. Maryland never seceded. The Union held, though the state's heart remained divided. War on home soil. The war came to Maryland's doorstep in 1862, when Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army crossed the Potomac and marched north. Near a small town called Sharpsburg, they met Union forces in a cornfield by Antietam Creek. What followed was the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 22,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The air was thick with smoke and silence. When it was over, Lee's army withdrew, and the Union claimed a gruesome victory. The Battle of Antietam changed more than military momentum. It changed the meaning of the war itself. Lincoln used the victory to announce the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for enslaved people in rebel states. Though it did not yet free those enslaved in Maryland, it lit a path toward their liberation. Freedom comes to Maryland. By 1864, as the war dragged on, Maryland drafted a new constitution. Debate was fierce, but Union troops stationed far from home voted overwhelmingly for change. That year, slavery was abolished in Maryland, 1 year before the 13th Amendment ended it nationwide. For the state's 90,000 formerly enslaved people, freedom arrived not as celebration, but as uncertainty. They had won their own liberation, yet the world around them still carried the habits of bondage. Many stayed where they were, working for wages on the same land they had once tilled in chains. Others moved to Baltimore or Annapolis, seeking education and independence. Churches became sanctuaries for the new citizens of freedom. AME and Baptist congregations founded schools and mutual aid societies. Hope took root in the very soil that had once grown tobacco. Reconstruction without Reconstruction. Because Maryland had never formally seceded, it escaped the harsh federal Reconstruction governance that transformed the Deep South. But that meant change came without protection. old elites quickly returned to power, and the progress of freedmen was met with systemic resistance. By 1867, a new constitution replaced the wartime one, restoring voting rights to former Confederates while doing little to secure civil rights for black citizens. The law had changed. Hearts had not. Still, in Baltimore and beyond, black Marylanders built institutions that would endure for generations. Morgan College, founded 1867, black-owned newspapers, and church networks that formed the backbone of community life. From fields to factories, the 1870s and 80s brought another transformation. Maryland was becoming an industrial state. Baltimore's harbor bustled with coal, iron, and manufactured goods. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad expanded westward, linking the Atlantic to the Midwest. Factories rose where plantations had once stood, and immigrants from Europe streamed into the city in search of work. But industrial progress came at a price. Working conditions were dangerous, pay was low, and housing cramped. In May 77, rail workers in Baltimore joined the Great Railroad Strike, demanding fair wages. The strike turned violent. Troops fired on crowds, and buildings burned. For a moment, it seemed the city might tear itself apart again. The lesson was clear. Freedom without fairness could ignite a different kind of war. A new century approaches. As the 19th century faded, Maryland entered the modern age with a foot in both worlds, industrial and agrarian, progressive and prejudiced. Its cities grew while its rural lands still echoed the rhythms of the Old South. The state had survived civil war and social upheaval, but it was not finished changing. Ahead lay an era of machines and migration, of subways and segregation, of innovation and inequality. The century when Maryland would become a microcosm of modern America itself. At the dawn of the 20th century, Maryland stood on the edge of something entirely new. The farms and fields that had shaped its past were now shadowed by chimneys and cranes, by streetcars clanging down Baltimore's roads, and by the rising hum of machines. The industrial age had fully arrived, and it was rewriting what it meant to be a Marylander. A new kind of power. Factories lined the Patapsco and the harbor. Ironworks, canneries, shipyards, and textile mills thrived. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Poland, and Italy filled the neighborhoods of East and South Baltimore. The smell of baking bread mixed with coal smoke and salt water. Children played in the alleys between tenements while their parents worked 12-hour shifts on the docks. The rhythm of life was hard but steady until 1904, when fire swept through downtown Baltimore. For 2 days, flames devoured more than 1,500 buildings. Smoke darkened the sky for miles, and when it finally ended, the city's heart lay in ruins. But out of the ashes came rebirth. The rebuilding of Baltimore was swift and determined. Wider streets, stronger buildings, and a new skyline that reflected both resilience and ambition. The city's motto could have been, "We will rise again," and it did, over and over. Progress and paradox. As Maryland modernized, progress came unevenly. For many white workers, industry meant mobility, a chance at a home, a steady wage and education for their children. For Black Marylanders, especially those moving north from the Deep South in the Great Migration, the promise of opportunity met the barriers of segregation. Baltimore passed one of the first housing segregation ordinances in the nation in 1910, a policy that would echo for decades. Black families were denied loans and restricted to overcrowded neighborhoods, even as they built thriving cultural and business centers of their own, churches, clubs, and schools that kept community alive in the face of exclusion. At the same time, Maryland continued to expand its infrastructure. Highways connected towns, streetcars carried commuters. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge, completed in 1902, linked east and west like a silver thread across the water. The bridge wasn't just an engineering feat, it was a symbol. For the first time, the state's divided geography felt connected. The bay, once a barrier, became a bridge to the future. War and change. Two world wars reshaped Maryland's economy and identity. During World War I, the shipyards of Baltimore roared to life, producing cargo vessels and munitions. Thousands of men and women took on industrial jobs. When the war ended, the factories went quiet, but only for a time. By World War II, Maryland was again at the heart of the war machine. The Bethlehem steel plant at Sparrows Point became one of the largest in the world, employing over 30,000 people. The clang of metal and the hiss of welding torches echoed across the bay. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, building ships, assembling weapons, and running offices. African Americans pressed for fair treatment and better jobs, laying the foundation for post-war civil rights activism. After the war, prosperity bloomed, and with it, the suburbs. Families moved from the row houses of Baltimore into new developments, stretching along freshly paved highways. Shopping centers, schools, and parks appeared almost overnight. For many, it was the realization of the American dream. For others, it was the beginning of new divisions, lines of race and class drawn along highways and zip codes. The Civil Rights Era. By the 1950s and 60s, the fight for equality swept through Maryland, just as it did across the South, though in its own way, quieter but no less determined. In Cambridge, on the Eastern Shore, protests led by Gloria Richardson challenged segregation in housing, schools, and jobs. In Baltimore, students held sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. Churches and community groups organized marches demanding fairness and opportunity. The state's proximity to Washington, D.C., made it a key crossroads of the national movement. Thousands of Marylanders joined the 1963 March on Washington, carrying signs for jobs and freedom. Many who heard Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech that day returned home to push for that dream in their own neighborhoods. But progress was not easy. In April 1968, after Dark King's assassination, anger boiled over in Baltimore. For days, the city burned again. Not from accident this time, but from grief and rage. The National Guard filled the streets. Thousands were arrested. When the smoke cleared, scars remained in buildings, in policy, and in memory. A state reimagined through the 19s and 1980s, Maryland transformed again. The steel mills that had once fueled its prosperity began to close. Factories shuttered, jobs moved elsewhere. But even as the old economy faded, a new one was taking the shape. Around Washington's suburbs, technology and research became Maryland's new engine. The National Institutes of Health, NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, and Johns Hopkins University turned the state into a global hub for science, medicine, and innovation. Maryland's economy shifted from manufacturing to information. Scientists replaced machinists, laptops replaced lathes. But this new prosperity wasn't universal. Baltimore struggled with unemployment, drugs, and violence, even as the suburbs grew wealthier. In the 1980s and 90s, Governor William Donald Schaefer, Baltimore's former mayor, pushed for revival. He built the Inner Harbor, transforming old piers into parks, shops, and museums. The National Aquarium opened in 1981, drawing millions. For a moment, Baltimore's skyline reflected optimism again, a glittering symbol of what rebirth could look like. The Chesapeake at risk. Even as Maryland advanced, its oldest companion, the Chesapeake Bay, began to cry for help. Pollution from farms, factories, and cities choked its waters. By the late 20th century, the bay's oyster population had collapsed by more than 90%. But Marylanders, whose identity is tied to that water, refused to surrender it. In 1983, the Chesapeake Bay program began, uniting scientists, policymakers, and fishermen in a single goal: to save the bay. Cleanup efforts improved wastewater treatment, reduced runoff, and restored wetlands. The bay's recovery is still fragile, but it remains a story of shared responsibility, proof that progress and preservation can coexist. Into the 21st century, the new millennium brought Maryland into another transformation. Its cities became laboratories of diversity and change. Montgomery and Prince George's counties grew into some of the wealthiest, most educated, and most diverse communities in America. Immigrants from Asia, Africa, and Latin America brought new energy to schools, businesses, and culture. In Baltimore, new challenges met new voices. The 2015 death of Freddie Gray, while in police custody, sparked protests and calls for justice that echoed far beyond the city. It forced Maryland and the nation to confront the unfinished work of equality. Through all this, the state's character endured, pragmatic, creative, and quietly resilient. Its politics remained a balance of progressivism and moderation, often producing leaders able to bridge divides. Its universities led in fields from biotechnology to climate science. Its people continued to draw strength from the mix of land and water, city and shore, history and hope. Maryland today. Look at Maryland today, and you'll see the entire American story condensed into one small space. It is both ancient and new, burdened and blessed. Its flag still flies over a landscape where freedom was debated, defended, and redefined. Its cities still pulse with invention. Its waters still mirror the sky. The Chesapeake remains its heart, not just a place, but a promise that no matter how often the tide rises or falls, Maryland will endure. From the Ark and the Dove to rocket launches at Goddard, from St. Mary's City to the streets of Baltimore, from the plantations of the past to the laboratories of the future, Maryland's story is one of evolution. A state that began as an experiment in tolerance has become a living example of complexity and coexistence. It has learned again and again that strength comes not from sameness, but from diversity, that resilience grows not from comfort, but from struggle, and that identity is not a fixed thing. It's a journey shaped by each generation that calls this place home. 400 years after its founding, Maryland stands where it always has, between worlds, yet belonging to both, still learning, still striving, still rising with the tide.